The silence hangs, broken only by the sound of heavy, labored breathing. The air struggles through damaged lungs, the noise of each breath filtered through metal. November 25th, 1177. In front of you stands a young boy, barely able to grip the leather reins. His hands are wrapped in linen bandages that were once white but are now stained a deep rusty brown. Beneath the cloth, the flesh is decaying with bone visible in places. Leprosy doesn't kill you instantly. It erases you piece by piece while you're still alive. The silver mask that covers his face isn't for decoration. It's vital. What lies beneath would make even the bravest soldiers turn away. 3 miles ahead, the horizon is lost to sight, swallowed up by dust. In the distance, an army of 26,000 warriors stretches across the land, their mounted cavalry so vast that the dust clouds they raise look like fog rolling in from the sea. Flags of green, black, and gold snap in the wind like the wings of predatory birds. The Sultan Saladin leads them. At 40 years old, undefeated and confident, he has already sent messages ahead to Damascus, boasting of the victory feast that will follow the coming battle. Behind the boy with the silver mask, there are only 500 knights. That's it. 500 tired men on worn horses, their armor battered from numerous battles, holding lances with broken tips and swords in desperate need of sharpening. The math is simple: 50 to enemies for every one of them. It's the kind of odds that don't even deserve discussion. You don't fight those odds. You surrender or die. Every advisor told him to stay behind Jerusalem's walls. Every military guide warns that charging into this battle would be suicide by cavalry. Even his own body, ravaged by disease, joints swollen, skin splitting, is telling him to stop. But BaldwinIVv does something unimaginable. He gives the order to charge. What happens next will defy all explanation. In the next 3 hours, the events will be so extraordinary that no one will be able to explain them. Christian chroniclers will call it divine intervention. Muslim historians will label it a catastrophe sent by God as punishment. Military experts will study it for centuries, trying to make sense of it. But here's the thing no one tells you about the Battle of Montgisard. The fight was already lost before a single lance was lowered. Saladin had made no mistakes. His army was fresh, well supplied, and perfectly positioned for a cavalry assault. His commanders were experienced, and his soldiers, the elite Mamluks, were slave warriors trained from childhood to kill. The Crusaders were hopelessly outnumbered. So how did 20,000 of Islam's finest warriors end up dead in a single afternoon? The answer is more complicated than anyone expected. It all begins with a decision Saladin made 3 days before the battle, a decision so perfect on paper that it would ultimately destroy everything he had worked for. Before we dive into the unraveling of history, a quick note: if you find yourself drawn to these lesser known moments in history, the ones textbooks often skip over, subscribing helps us dig deeper into the past and uncover these powerful stories. Now back to November 1177. The most dangerous man in the Holy Land is about to make his first major mistake. Jerusalem in 1177 isn't the golden city of legend. It's a broken shell, barely alive. The city walls are cracked from decades of siege. The streets are half empty, as anyone who could escape has already fled. The most sacred city in Christendom, now defended by fewer soldiers than a modern -day high school has students. The kingdom is barely holding itself together, stitched together with denial and stubbornness. And sitting on the throne is a 16-year-old boy whose body is failing him. BaldwinIV was never meant to be king. He was supposed to survive this long. Leprosy in the 12th century was just a disease. It was a visible curse, a sign of divine punishment. Lepers had to ring bells to warn people of their approach. They were buried in unmarked graves, erased from family records, treated as if they were already dead the moment the first white patch appeared on their skin. But Baldwin's father, King Amalric, saw something in his son that disease couldn't touch: intelligence, clarity, and a mind sharp enough to cut through problems like a blade through silk. So, when Amalric died unexpectedly in 1174, the crown went to a 13-year-old boy who would never marry, never have children, and whose kingdom was already on its last legs. And then, there was Saladin, the man who stood ready to take everything. Born Yscfid in Aub, Saladin's rise from military commander to sultan was a journey marked by military genius, one it would have made even Machiavelli envious. By 1177 he had done what generations before him failed, to unite Egypt and Syria under a single banner with one mission: reclaim Jerusalem. At 40 years old, at the peak of his power, Saladin commanded endless wealth from Egypt, test raid routes, warriors from dozens of territories, and siege weapons that could crack fortresses like eggs. What should have terrified the Crusaders most was just his resources or power. It was Saladin's humanity. He wasn't a monster. He was pious, diplomatic, and respected, even by his enemies. He followed the rules of war, which was fine when his enemies were ready to lose. But when you're fighting for survival, the rules don't matter. By the fall of 1177, Europe had given up on Jerusalem. Even the Pope was quietly negotiating what would happen after the city fell. If you can't see how close we came to watching history pivot on the decisions of a dying teenager and 500 desperate men, you're missing the lesson our ancestors fought and died to teach us. The world doesn't care about your odds, it only cares about your will. BaldwinIVv's situation was hopeless. Inside Jerusalem, the defenders were outnumbered and exhausted. The numbers alone painted a grim picture: a city garrison of just 750 men, mostly infantry. Only around 500 knights, if they called in every favor. And even the mighty Templars' 80 warrior monks were exhausted from holding off Saladin's forces along the borders. The rest of the kingdom's military leaders, those who hadn't already fled, were already recommending surrender. Raymond of Tripoli, one of the kingdom's most experienced commanders, spoke bluntly: "Sire, we should negotiate terms while we still have something to bargain with. If we ride out, we die. If we die, the kingdom dies with us." Baldwin slumped on his throne and seemed to consider it. His body was falling apart. His joints swelled with every movement, and even standing for more than a few minutes was a struggle. His hands, so disfigured by leprosy that they could barely grip anything, were shaking. But Baldwin understood the stakes. If he stayed behind Jerusalem's walls, the city might hold for weeks, or even months. But Saladin would destroy every village, every farm, and every church within 50 miles. The civilian population would suffer slowly and painfully. If he marched out with his 500 knights, they would die quickly, but at least they could buy time for the peasants to survive long enough for help to arrive. It wasn't a choice between victory and defeat, it was a choice between dying with purpose, or dying slowly while watching everyone else suffer first. Baldwin lifted his head, and the light from the torches glinted off his silver mask. "Raymond," he asked, "how fast can Saladin's army move when it's spread out foraging?" Raymond was puzzled. "Slower than usual, sire. They need time to reform their ranks." Baldwin, weak and feverish, smiled. "What if we hit them while they're scattered?" The room fell silent. The idea was bold and sane even, but Baldwin had seen something that his advisors hadn't. He had recognized a pattern in Saladin's movements, a mistake that could turn the tide of the battle. Saladin's army, spread out and unprepared, was about to be caught off guard. On November 24th, BaldwinIV, carried on a litter because his legs could no longer carry him, was taken to the royal armory. His hands were so damaged that his fingers barely closed, so the sword had to be tied to his wrist with leather straps. The knights helped him into his armor, and despite his frailty, Baldwin ordered the entire available force to prepare for immediate march. It was a force of just 500 knights, 80 Templars, and 3,000 infantry, far fewer than Saladin's 26,000 warriors. The journey began at night. Baldwin and his men covered 45 miles in 36 hours. This kind of pace would exhaust healthy cavalry in good weather, but these men went arching with a dying king towards certain death, and yet they pressed on. It was nothing short of impossible. But as they marched, Baldwin kept asking his scouts the same question: is Saladin still moving north? Is his army still spread out? Each time the scouts confirmed. Baldwin, despite his fever and exhaustion, smiled beneath his silver mask. The knights didn't understand. They assumed it was delirium, that their king was losing his mind. But Baldwin had seen something no one else had noticed. He knew that Saladin would make the logical, correct decision, and the decision would doom him. By the morning of November 25th, the Crusaders were in position. Baldwin's army had reached a ridge, and Saladin, unaware the Crusaders' advance, was still moving his army across the plains. It was then that Baldwin's knights saw something they cannot believe standing on the ridge, silhouetted against the rising sun. was the figure of a man in armor, a silver mask reflecting the first light of dawn. One of Saladin's commanders whispered, "Is that the leper king?" Saladin, realizing for the first time that he had made a critical error, muttered under his breath, "God help us." He came. Saladin had never made a mistake like this before. His army, though confident, had become complacent after days of easy marches. They were scattered, unprepared, and now they were about to face the full force of Baldwin's 500 knights. As the Crusaders surged forward, the Muslim forces began scrambling to form defensive lines. They were too slow. Baldwin's knights, knowing the stakes, moved with purpose, and as they closed in on the Muslim army, Saladin's forces began to panic. At 400 yards, they could see the Crusaders charging at them. At 300 yards, Muslim archers fired arrows that fell like black rain. The first wave of Crusaders faltered, but they did not stop. At 200 yards, Saladin's Mamluks, elite soldiers who had never lost a battle, scrambled to form ranks. But they were terrified not of the numbers but of the madness of the charge coming at them. At 100 yards, something incredible happened. Baldwin, who had been strapped to his horse and could barely move, drew his sword. It shouldn't have been possible. His hands were too damaged to hold the weapon, but somehow he raised it above his head, signaling the charge. The knights watching their dying king saw the sword lifted and heard the cry of fury and faith that rose from their ranks. As the Crusaders closed in, Muslim soldiers in the front lines dropped their weapons and ran. The charge hit like a hammer. The sound was not what anyone expected. There was no clean ringing of swords, just a wet, crushing impact as horses and men collided. In the first moments of the battle, 300 Mamluks were trampled underfoot, their bodies crushed by the weight of the horses. But the charge didn't stop. It didn't slow down. Cavalry charges were supposed to hit hard and wheel away to regroup. But the Templars pressed on, cutting through the Muslim center like a blade through flesh. And behind them, Baldwin's secular knights bored through the gap, widening it, turning it into a wound that would never heal. By 2:30 M. Saladin's center, composed of 8,000 of his best warriors, broke. Not a retreat, not a tactical fallback, but a complete collapse. Soldiers threw down their weapons, tearing off their armor in panic, trampling each other in their desperate attempt to flee. Saladin's own officers screamed at them to reform the lines, but it was too late. Baldwin's knights were already cutting through, and his presence, his relentless charge, was breaking them. Saladin himself, realizing that the battle was lost, mounted a camel and fled, leaving behind his army. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, who had never known defeat, was now running for his life. By 4 p.m. the battlefield was littered with bodies. 20,000 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying, and another 6,000 had fled into the desert, abandoning everything. The Crusaders, though they had lost many of their own, had won. They had done the impossible. When Baldwin was finally pulled from his horse, he was unconscious, his body nearly broken from the effort. His bandages were out through with blood, and his wounds were so severe that it seemed like he had pushed himself to the brink of death. Odo of Santa, the Templar Grand Master, who had witnessed Baldwin's struggle, checked for any signs of life. He found Baldwin still breathing, barely. In an emotional moment, he whispered, "He can't feel pain." That's how he did it. He didn't know when to stop. Baldwin, the boy whose body had betrayed him long ago, had led 500 men to victory against 26,000, not because of strength or better tactics, or superior weapons, but because he refused to accept the inevitable. He believed in the power of will over math, of determination over odds. When Baldwin regained consciousness, the battle was over, but the toll on his body had been catastrophic. His hands, swollen and infected from the physical exertion, had done the impossible, gripping the sword for hours, but at the cost of accelerating his illness. The doctors who attended him were faced with a grim choice: amputation, or risk further spreading the infection that was eating him alive. Baldwin was only 16, yet his body, ravaged by leprosy, had been pushed beyond its limits in the name of victory. The kingdom that had been on the brink of collapse was now given a reprieve thanks to the resolve of a dying boy and the men who followed him. While the peasants of Jerusalem celebrated the victory, singing and dancing in the streets, church bells ringing in honor of what they called a miracle, Baldwin's victory came at a cost no one could ignore. His body had been pushed beyond the point of no return. His kingdom had won the battle, but the king himself was losing the war against his own body. His flesh, already deteriorating, had been pushed to the brink. He had given everything to save Jerusalem, but the price was steep. The next day, as the Crusaders began to reorganize and assess their victory, the magnitude of the spoils became apparent. Saladin's entire supply rain tents, weapons, gold, food for 26,000 men was now in Crusader hands. The Templars alone captured enough military equipment to supply every Christian fortress in the region. Saladin's war chest, full of gold meant to fund his siege of Jerusalem, was now in the hands of Baldwin's forces. It would provide the Crusader kingdom with the resources it needed to survive for another 2 years. But the true cost of the victory, the long-term consequences, were felt far beyond the battlefield. Saladin's reputation, built over years of careful conquest and diplomacy, was shattered in a single afternoon. His army, undefeated and elite, had been routed by just 500 knights. Muslim chroniclers struggled to explain the disaster. This was the most terrible catastrophe to befall the believers in this age, one wrote. Another, more bluntly declared, God turned his face from us that day. Saladin's invincibility had been shattered. His forces were in disarray, and the Muslim world was left reeling. The psychological impact of this defeat would take years to undo. Saladin's dream of uniting the Muslim world under one banner, of retaking Jerusalem with a single stroke, was shattered in a matter of hours. It would take him a decade to rebuild what Baldwin had destroyed, and just a few moments of unthinkable resolve. But even as Saladin struggled to regain his footing, Baldwin's body, ravaged by disease and stress, continued to deteriorate. His victory was fleeting, but its impact was far minus reaching. In the years that followed, BaldwinIV would face even more battles with his body, fighting not just Saladin but the disease that slowly consumed him. His body would continue to break down, his eyesight failing, his limbs growing weaker, but his mind remained sharp. He would defend Jerusalem against Saladin's forces 3 more times, never with more than 1,000 knights, and never losing. In 1183, 6 years after the Battle of Montgisard, Baldwin and Saladin met under a truce flag to discuss prisoner exchanges. Baldwin, now blind and barely able to speak, was carried on a litter. Saladin, looking at the broken shell of the king who had haunted his dreams for years, said something that was faithfully recorded by Muslim chroniclers. I do not understand how God could give such a mind to such a body. Baldwin's reply, whispered through a translator because his voice was too weak to carry, was simple but profound, perhaps so that when I win, no one can claim it was by strength alone. 2 years after BaldwinIV's death in 1185, Saladin, having waited for the young king's passing, finally conquered Jerusalem. Without Baldwin's leadership, the Crusader states fell apart quickly. What Baldwin had held together with nothing but willpower for 8 years was now gone. His successors could not match his resolve, and in the end, they lost everything Baldwin had fought to protect. But the real lesson of BaldwinIV's reign is one that transcends the military history of the time. It is a reminder of how fragile civilization is, how close we always are to losing everything. Baldwin's story teaches us that moments of history do not hinge on numbers, strength, or material resources. They are decided by the human will, the force of a single individual who refuses to accept the odds, who pushes beyond the limits of the body, and who believes in something greater than the calculations of the battlefield. The Battle of Montgisard is a perfect example of this truth. 500 men against 26,000. The odds worst act impossibly against them. Yet they won not because of superior tactics, better weapons, or the perfect terrain, but because they followed a king who refused to surrender, who refused to let go of the will to fight. BaldwinIV did not know when to stop, and that was what made him and his knights unstoppable. In the age of algorithms and data models, we often forget the power of the human will. We rely on numbers to predict outcomes, to decide who wins and who loses. But the true lesson of BaldwinIV's victory is this: sometimes the numbers don't matter. When someone refuses to accept the math, when they refuse to accept the inevitable, everything can change. Baldwin's victory was just a moment in history. It was a reminder that one person's refusal to quit can change the course of the world. Baldwin's story is a testament to the power of will over fate, and it's a lesson we should never forget. The air in Jerusalem had been thick with tension long before BaldwinIV made his fateful decision. The city, once a beacon of faith and hope for Christians across Europe, had become a shell of its former self. The Crusaders, scattered and outnumbered, had been preparing for the worst. Inside the walls, the mood was grim, and the advisors surrounding Baldwin knew just how hopeless their situation was. Yet the young king, with his body ravaged by disease, refused to bend. Jerusalem by November 1177 was a kingdom hanging on by a thread. The kingdom's walls, cracked and weakened by years of siege, seemed like the only thing holding it together. Baldwin, despite his illness, had learned to rule with a clear mind. He understood that his kingdom was living on borrowed time. Even his enemies respected his intellect, his sharpness despite his body's decay. What most didn't know, however, was that Baldwin had already come to terms with the fact that he would not live long enough to see his reign end in peace. But what he hadn't come to terms with was the thought of his people suffering at the hands of Saladin without a fight. That thought was intolerable to him. Baldwin's decision to charge into the face of impossible odds wasn't made out of desperation or recklessness. It came from a deep understanding of the situation, a calculation not based on logic, but on something far more dangerous: his will to fight. He knew he might die on that battlefield, but he also knew that by charging he could give his knights and soldiers something that they hadn't had in months' hope. And so, despite the overwhelming odds, Baldwin gave the command to charge. His body, already weakened by leprosy, could barely hold the reins, and his joints screamed in agony with every movement. But he did it anyway. He smiled beneath his silver mask as the Crusaders, all 500 of them, prepared for battle. They were not soldiers preparing to defend a city. They were men who were about to face certain death, but with a king who would not quit. As they marched towards Saladin's army, Baldwin's mind was clear, focused, despite the fever that clouded his senses. He had seen something in the enemy's movements that the others had missed. The scattered forces of Saladin, busy looting and foraging, had left themselves vulnerable. Baldwin, aware of his own failing body, could see that this was the perfect moment to strike. The Crusaders, despite their exhaustion, followed their king into the unknown. There was no fear in their eyes, there was only determination. They had seen their king, a boy whose flesh was falling apart, leading them toward what seemed like certain death, and they would follow him anywhere. The significance of this moment was lost on none of them. Baldwin IV was not just leading an army, he was leading a people who had already written their own eulogy. His decision to charge wasn't a display of arrogance or youthful bravado. It was an embodiment of the very essence of leadership, a willingness to sacrifice everything for something greater than oneself. Baldwin's body had betrayed him, but his mind and will remained steadfast, unwavering in its conviction that the kingdom of Jerusalem deserved to fight, even against impossible odds. As the charge began, the ground shook beneath the hooves of the 500 knights, and the air grew thick with the sounds of battle. Baldwin, despite his frailty, leaned forward in his saddle, his face hidden behind the silver mask, but his presence unmistakable. His knights surged forward, and as the charge intensified, something extraordinary happened. The fearsome Mamluks, elite warriors who had never known defeat, hesitated. They had heard of the Leper King, but they had never witnessed the madness of his determination. At that moment, Baldwin's knights understood. It wasn't about the numbers. It wasn't about the weapons or the armor. It was about the human will, unbroken, unyielding, refusing to accept that fate was already decided. Baldwin IV's will, unstoppable and unrelenting, had become the driving force behind the Crusader charge. He led them not with the strength of a healthy king, but with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. The battle raged on, and as the Crusaders made their way through Saladin's scattered forces, the odds no longer seemed so insurmountable. The Muslim warriors, caught off guard by the ferocity of the charge, began to break. Some fled in terror, while others threw down their weapons in surrender. The tide of battle was turning, and Baldwin, despite the overwhelming physical pain, could still feel the rush of triumph. His body was failing him, but his spirit, his indomitable spirit, was still very much alive. The turning point came when Baldwin's knights reached the heart of Saladin's forces. The Mamluks, who had been trained for years to fight with precision and discipline, were now running for their lives. They were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting to escape the madness that had descended upon them. Baldwin IV, his sword raised high despite his broken body, became the symbol of the impossible proof that willpower could overcome even the most insurmountable odds. As the battle reached its peak, Baldwin's forces cut through Saladin's elite soldiers, driving a wedge through their ranks. The sound of the charge was deafening, men and horses colliding, screams filling the air. But it was just the noise that made this moment so extraordinary. It was the realization that against all odds, the Crusaders were winning. And Baldwin IV, the boy king who had been written off by so many, was the one leading them to victory. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of Saladin's finest warriors. 20,000 of his soldiers lay dead, their bodies strewn across the blood-soaked turf. And the Crusaders had paid a heavy price. 500 men had fought, and many were lost. Their victory was undeniable. They had done the impossible. They had defeated Saladin's army not because they had more men or better resources, but because they had followed a leader who had already lost everything but his will to fight. BaldwinIVv's victory at Montgisard was not just a military triumph, it was a testament to the power of the human spirit. It was proof that when one person refuses to accept the inevitable, when they push beyond their own limitations, they can change the course of history. Baldwin's story is a reminder of how fragile civilization is, how close we always are to losing everything. It's a reminder that it only takes one person, one moment, one decision to turn the tide of history. BaldwinIVv's decision to charge was not just a tactical maneuver, it was an act of defiance against the very idea of fate itself. A boy who had been told his entire life that he wouldn't survive long enough to grow into a man, a king who was expected to die in a monastery, was now standing at the helm of his kingdom, willing to risk everything to keep his people alive. But his strength came not from his body, but from the willpower that had sustained him through his years of suffering. His advisors, those who had stayed behind, watched in disbelief as Baldwin ordered the charge. They had seen their king's body slowly wither over the years, his once strong frame now almost unrecognizable. But in that moment, Baldwin was no longer a boy on the verge of death. He was a king, a leader, a symbol of resistance. His will became the catalyst for a charge that, against all logic, would change the course of history. As Baldwin led his men through the dust and chaos of the battlefield, the contrast between the two armies could not have been starker. On one side were the elite Mamluks, battle-hardened warriors who had been raised to kill from a young age. They had been trained in every aspect of warfare and had never known defeat. On the other side was Baldwin's first 500 exhausted knights, many of whom had barely enough strength to lift their swords, fighting not just for their lives, but for the survival of their entire kingdom. The first few moments of the charge were nothing short of chaotic. The Crusaders, despite their numerical disadvantage, pressed forward with a ferocity that took Saladin's forces completely off guard. The Mamluks, who had expected an easy victory, now found themselves facing an onslaught they had not prepared for. The cavalry charge, once a well-oiled machine of destruction, now seemed like a runaway train, unstoppable and fueled by the sheer determination of the men leading it. Baldwin's knights had learned it from their king. They had seen him suffer, they had seen him endure pain that would have broken most men, and they had seen him smile through it all. They had watched as he led them from the brink of despair to victory time and time again. They followed him not because of his strength or his weapons, but because they believed in his resolve. When Baldwin lifted his sword, signaling the charge, they followed without hesitation, knowing that if their king could continue fighting, so could they. As the battle raged on, it became clear that Baldwin's charge was not just a battle for victory, it was a fight for the very soul of the kingdom. The Crusaders, despite their exhaustion and physical limitations, fought with a sense of purpose that Saladin's army couldn't match. The Muslim warriors, despite their training and experience, were shaken by the madness of the Crusader charge. They had been prepared to face a defeated, demoralized enemy, but they were facing something much more dangerous, a people who had nothing left to lose. As Baldwin's knights drove deeper into Saladin's forces, the Mamluks began to break. They had never faced an enemy like this before, an enemy that refused to give up, an enemy that fought not just for survival but for something greater. Baldwin's victory was not just a military achievement, it was a triumph of the human spirit, a testament to the power of will over circumstance. By the time the battle was over, Saladin's forces had been decimated. 20,000 of his warriors lay dead, and the remainder had scattered into the desert, abandoning their weapons, their armor, and their pride. The Crusaders, though victorious, had suffered heavy losses. But their victory was not just the result of better tactics or superior weapons, it was the result of a single decision, made by a king who refused to accept the inevitability of defeat. The aftermath of the Battle of Montgisard left the Crusaders with mixed emotions. They had won, yes, but at what cost? Baldwin IV, who would lead his men to this impossible victory, was barely alive. The battle had taken its toll on his already frail body. His wounds, some caused by the intense physical exertion of wielding a sword that his hands could barely hold, were grave. But despite the pain, despite the exhaustion that should have rendered him immobile, Baldwin still clung to life. The Crusaders, exhausted and bloody, began to gather the fallen from both sides. There were cries of triumph, but there was no joy in the air. The silence after the roar of the battle was deafening. The desert winds carried away the dust, but the stench of death remained. Saladin's army, once a force so feared across the Holy Land, lay broken and scattered. His elite Mamluks, the warriors who had been trained since childhood to kill, were dead or fleeing, their pride shattered. In the midst of it all, Baldwin was carried from the battlefield on a litter. His men, those who had witnessed his unwavering resolve, could not understand how he had kept going. They had watched him, a boy whose body was rotting, charge into battle without a second thought. Some of them believed it was madness. Others believed it was divine will. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't see, was that Baldwin's refusal to stop was what made him so dangerous. He had pushed past the pain, past the point of no return, and in doing so, he had led them to victory. But the victory was bittersweet. As the Crusaders began to regroup and assess the cost of the battle, Baldwin was already slipping away. His doctors, who had been with him through every stage of his decline, knew that his time was running out. The battle had accelerated his disease, the stress of combat causing the necrosis in his flesh to spread at an alarming rate. His hands, swollen and oozing with infection, were beyond saving. His joints, already stiff from leprosy, had been further damaged by the effort of fighting. The victory at Montgisard had secured Jerusalem for the time being, but Baldwin had paid the ultimate price. His body, already fragile and dying, could not withstand the strain. Baldwin's determination to defend his kingdom, to fight for his people despite his illness, had cost him everything. His doctors discussed amputations, but even that was unlikely to save him. They were faced with the grim reality Baldwin would not survive much longer. As Baldwin lay in his chambers, his body ravaged by disease, the news of his victory spread. The streets of Jerusalem erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, and the people who had lived in fear for so long finally felt a glimmer of hope. They hailed Baldwin as a hero, a king who had defied the odds, a king who would lead them to victory against all expectations. Yet in the royal chambers there was no celebration. The physicians worked in silence, their faces grim as they tried to find a way to ease Baldwin's suffering. He had won the battle, but his body was too far gone to recover. The victory that had seemed like a miracle came at a heavy price. Baldwin IV, the leper king who had defied death at Montgisard, was now facing his final battle. The loss of Baldwin would be a devastating blow to the Crusader kingdom. Without him, the balance of power in the Holy Land would shift dramatically. The Crusaders had fought to hold on to their land, but they had done so with a king who had pushed himself to the very limit of human endurance. Baldwin's success had been built on sheer willpower, and without him, there was no one left to fill his shoes. The Crusaders who had followed him into battle would now have to find a way to carry on without the king who had been their guiding light. In the wake of Baldwin's eventual death in 1185, Jerusalem would find itself vulnerable once more. His successors, though brave, lacked the strength and vision that Baldwin had brought to the kingdom. The Crusader states, which had been bolstered by Baldwin's victories, would begin to crumble without his leadership. The balance of power in the region would shift once again, and the shadow of Saladin, who had been humble but not defeated, would loom large over the Crusader kingdoms. But BaldwinIV's legacy would not be forgotten. His name would be remembered not just for the victories he achieved, but for the spirit he embodied. He had shown the world that human will could overcome even the greatest odds. He had led his men into battle, not because he was strong, but because he was unwilling to accept the inevitable. His refusal to stop, to give in to the disease that was slowly killing him, had been the spark that ignited the Crusaders' victory at Montgisard. The Battle of Montgisard would go down in history as a miracle. The battle where a dying king and a handful of knights had defeated an army more than 50 times their size. But for those who were there, who fought alongside Baldwin IV, the battle was a symbol of something far greater than military strategy or superior tactics. It was a reminder that, in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit could triumph. Baldwin had refused to surrender, and in doing so, he had shown that sometimes, against all logic, the impossible could become reality. As BaldwinIV's condition continued to deteriorate, the atmosphere within Jerusalem grew increasingly tense. Despite the celebrations following the hard-earned victory at Montgisard, the Crusaders were acutely aware that the kingdom was teetering on the edge. Baldwin had managed to pull off the impossible, leading them to a victory against overwhelming odds, but at the cost of his own health. His body, ravaged by leprosy, was no longer able to keep up with his indomitable will. Every day his strength waned, and the fear of what would come after his inevitable death hung heavy in the air. For the knights who had followed Baldwin into battle, the future seemed uncertain. They had followed him not just out of duty but because of the belief that their king was invincible, that his resolve was stronger than any army they would face. But as Baldwin's health declined further, their confidence faltered. Baldwin was no longer the vibrant, commanding presence that had once inspired them. He was now a frail figure, too weak to even stand without assistance. His hands bound by bandages, his body barely able to function. His victory at Montgisard had been a moment of sheer willpower, but it was also a brief, fleeting moment in the grand scheme of his declining health. In the years following Baldwin's victory, the Crusader kingdom began to show signs of fragmentation. Without his leadership, the kingdom was vulnerable. The unity that Baldwin had forged among the Crusaders began to fracture. The nobles, commanders, and knights who had once stood together under his command now found themselves squabbling for power, unsure of who could fill the void left by their king. As Baldwin's death grew imminent, Saladin, who had been defeated at Montgisard but not broken, began to plan his next move. He knew that the Crusaders were at their weakest without Baldwin. The victory had bought the Crusaders time, but it was only a matter of time before they would lose their grip on the Holy Land. Saladin had waited for years, respecting Baldwin as a worthy opponent, but he understood that the death of the young king would signal the beginning of the end for the Crusader presence in the region. In the months leading up to Baldwin's death, there was an eerie quiet in Jerusalem. The city, which had once been a beacon of hope for the Crusaders, now felt like a place waiting for the inevitable. Baldwin's health worsened by the day, and though his mind remained sharp, his body was failing him faster than anyone could have anticipated. The doctors, who had done their best to keep him alive, could do little more than offer comfort. Baldwin's legacy was now being defined not by the victories he had won, but by the extraordinary toll his body had taken in order to achieve them. As Baldwin's health continued to deteriorate, the people of Jerusalem, those who had witnessed his incredible determination and his refusal to surrender, began to realize the depth of his sacrifice. He had not only fought for his kingdom, he had fought for their future, for their survival, even as his body slowly succumbed to the disease. The victory at Montgisard had been a victory for all of Christendom, but it had come at a cost that was now painfully clear to those who had watched their king endure what no man should have had to endure. When BaldwinIV passed away in 1185, his death was not just the loss of a king, it was the loss of a symbol. Baldwin had been more than a ruler, he had been a living testament to the power of the human will. He had shown his people that even in the face of death, it was possible to resist, to fight for what was worth preserving. His death marked the end of an era for the Crusaders, and the beginning of a new chapter in the struggle for Jerusalem. In the aftermath of Baldwin's death, the Crusader kingdom began to crumble. His successors, though brave, were unable to hold the kingdom together in the way Baldwin had. The unity that Baldwin had cultivated in his lifetime quickly disintegrated, and without his guiding hand, the Crusaders were prepared to defend their land against Saladin's renewed assault. The battles that followed would be less about tactics and more about survival, as the Crusader states, already weakened by internal divisions, faced the full force of Saladin's army once again. Yet, despite the fall of Jerusalem and the eventual reconquest by Saladin, BaldwinIV's legacy endured. His defiance, his unyielding will to fight despite his illness, became the stuff of legend. In the centuries that followed, historians would look back on Baldwin's reign as one of the most remarkable periods in Crusader history. His victory at Montgisard, where a dying king led 500 men to defeat 26,000 of the finest warriors in the Muslim world, became a symbol of what could be achieved when the human spirit refused to accept defeat. BaldwinIV had been more than just a king, he had been a leader who inspired those around him to believe that victory was possible, even when the odds were insurmountable. His story was one of perseverance, of fighting against both external enemies and the ravages of disease. And it reminded the world that sometimes, the greatest victories are won not by strength and numbers, but by the power of the will to survive and to fight for what is right. As time moved on, the impact of BaldwinIV's reign continued to resonate throughout the Crusader states, even after his death. The subsequent years saw Saladin regaining much of the territory the Crusaders had held, but the psychological damage inflicted by Baldwin's last at Montgisard was not so easily erased. For Saladin and his forces, the memory of the 500 knights who had taken on 26,000 of his soldiers was a wound that would never truly heal. The Muslim world, which had once viewed the Crusaders as a weakened enemy, now saw them as an opponent capable of feats of extraordinary willpower and resilience. Baldwin's victory had, in the end, not only preserved Jerusalem for a time, but had forced Saladin to reconsider his approach to the Crusaders. His entire strategy had been based on the idea that the Crusader states were fragile, ripe for the taking. But the events of November 25, 1177 shattered that illusion. For the first time, Saladin realized that the Crusaders, though outnumbered, might still have a strength within them that went beyond their numbers or weapons. The years following Baldwin's death brought more conflicts and shifting alliances, but the Crusader states were never the same. The unity that Baldwin had carefully nurtured over the years was shattered in his absence. His successors, while brave, were unable to inspire the same loyalty or evoke the same sense of mission. The kingdom, which had once been a beacon of hope for Christendom, was now slipping into disarray. Its leaders focused more on internal struggles for power and on defending against the growing threat from Saladin. For Saladin, the victory that should have marked the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land felt hollow. He had taken back Jerusalem in 1187, but it was a victory that came with a sense of unease. BaldwinIV's legend, his refusal to accept defeat even as his body was ravaged by disease, remained a haunting presence. Saladin's victory, although monumental, felt like an incomplete conquest. He had defeated the Crusaders, but in his heart, he knew that Baldwin had shown them the one thing that no army could ever truly defeat: the unshakable strength of the human will. In the years after Baldwin's death, the Crusader states faced increasing pressure from both within and without. The death of Baldwin had left a power vacuum that his successors could not fill, and the internal divisions began to tear the kingdom apart. Rivalries between factions grew stronger, and the unity that had once been the hallmark of Baldwin's reign began to dissolve. Without Baldwin to hold everything together, the Crusader kingdom was left vulnerable to Saladin's renewed campaigns. Despite the mounting challenges, BaldwinIV's legacy continued to inspire those who had fought alongside him. His knights, though scattered and broken, remembered the fierce resolve that had propelled them into battle at Montgisard. Many of them would continue to fight for the cause, but none would ever truly match the king who had led them with such unflinching determination. Baldwin had shown them that even in the darkest of times, it was possible to stand tall, to push forward, and to fight for something greater than oneself. In the years that followed, the Crusaders continued to battle Saladin for control of the Holy Land, but the shadow of BaldwinIV loomed over every conflict. His example, his unwavering belief that one could still make a difference even in the face of overwhelming odds, became a rallying cry for the beleaguered defenders of Jerusalem. But with Baldwin's death, the Crusaders had lost their greatest leader. The final fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was not just the end of a kingdom, it was the end of an era. The end of the dream that BaldwinIV had fought so hard to protect. Baldwin's story, however, did not end with his death. His legacy endured in the hearts of those who had followed him, and in the hearts of all who believed in the power of will over circumstance. History would remember BaldwinIV as the leper king who defied the odds, who led his men to victory against an enemy that outnumbered them 50-1. His battle at Montgisard would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary feats in military history. But it was more than just a battle. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when one person refused to accept the impossible, when one person believed that victory could still be won, no matter the cost. Even as Saladin claimed victory and retook Jerusalem, Baldwin's spirit lived on. The story of his defiance, but his unrelenting fight against both disease and an overwhelming enemy, became a story that transcended time. It became a reminder that sometimes, the greatest victories are not won with strength and numbers, but with the sheer force of will. Baldwin IV had given the Crusaders one final gift, proof that the impossible was never truly impossible, as long as someone was willing to fight for it. In the years that followed Baldwin IV's death, the Crusader states found themselves facing a grim reality. Saladin, now fully in control of Jerusalem and much of the surrounding region, could not ignore the legacy of Baldwin IV. While the Crusaders were struggling to reorganize and fortify their defenses, they were not entirely without hope. Baldwin had shown them that the fight was worth it, that even when all seemed lost, there was strength in defiance, and courage in the face of certain defeat. His reign had proved that sometimes leadership is about more than just strategy. It is about inspiring others to do the impossible, even when everything points to failure. Yet, in the aftermath of his death, the Crusader state splintered. Baldwin had been a figurehead who united the kingdom through sheer force of will, but without him, the various factions within the kingdom began to pull in different directions. Some of the nobles sought power for themselves, while others, still loyal to Baldwin's memory, tried desperately to hold on to what little unity remained. But it was clear that without a king like Baldwin, the kingdom would not survive long. Saladin, while a brilliant tactician and a formidable leader, also understood the psychological toll Baldwin's victory at Montgisard had taken on him. It was not just the loss of 20,000 men that haunted Saladin, it was the reminder that the Crusaders were capable of defying the odds, of fighting back against impossible odds with a leader who had nothing left to lose. The defeat had shaken Saladin's confidence, and though he would ultimately reclaim Jerusalem in 1187, he knew that Baldwin had fought for war on a different level. Baldwin had fought not just for land, but for survival, for the belief that his people, his faith, and his kingdom were worth defending. Despite his victory, Saladin could not escape the shadow of Baldwin IV. Every time he looked at the city of Jerusalem, which he had won back through military might, he remembered the king who had defied him and his army. Baldwin's spirits seemed to hang over the city, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human will could prevail. Saladin in his later years would often reflect on Baldwin not just as an enemy, but as a king who had demonstrated extraordinary strength that Saladin, despite his military genius, had never fully understood until it was too late. After the fall of Jerusalem, the remaining Crusader states, scattered and fractured, would struggle to hold their ground against Saladin's forces. The kingdom of Jerusalem, once a proud Christian stronghold in the heart of the Holy Land, began to fade into history. The Crusaders would continue to fight for the next several decades, but without Baldwin IV, they could never truly reclaim the unity and strength that he had forged. His successes, though brave, could not inspire the same devotion that Baldwin had earned through sheer force of will. They lacked his vision, his mind, and above all, his unshakable resolve. It was not long before the Crusader states began to disintegrate. Saladin's forces steadily reclaimed more land, and the Crusaders, weakened by internal strife and the absence of Baldwin's leadership, were unable to offer significant resistance. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was not just the end of a city, it marked the end of an era in the Holy Land. Baldwin IV, though he had fought with every ounce of strength left in his body, was no longer there to guide the Crusaders. Without him, their cause seemed lost. But Baldwin's legacy did not die with the kingdom. His story, and his incredible triumph at Montgisard, continued to be told for generations. His name became synonymous with courage and determination, a reminder to those who followed that even in the face of impossible odds, there was always a chance for victory. The battle at Montgisard, where 500 knights, led by a dying king, had defeated 26,000 warriors, became a symbol of resistance. A story that would be passed down through the ages as proof that sometimes, human will can defy the laws of nature and the fate that seems preordained. As the Crusader states fell one by one, and as Saladin's empire expanded, Baldwin IV's name continued to resonate. It was not just the military victory at Montgisard that people remembered, it was the idea that no matter the circumstances, no matter the odds, one could always choose to fight. Baldwin IV had made that choice, even when his own body betrayed him, even when the kingdom seemed on the brink of collapse. He had chosen to fight, and in doing so he had inspired countless others to do the same. Centuries later, Baldwin IV's name would be remembered as a king who, despite his physical frailty and the overwhelming forces against him, had shown the world that victory was not just a matter of numbers, tactics, or weapons, it was a matter of will. His story became an enduring symbol of what it meant to lead, to fight, and to persevere even when all seemed lost. The loss of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, left a gaping hole not just in the Crusader kingdom, but in the hearts of those who had fought beside him. His extraordinary leadership in the face of such insurmountable odds had been a guiding light for the Crusaders. Without him, the Crusader states found themselves fragmented, their leaders struggling to hold on to the kingdom Baldwin had preserved through sheer determination. His death, while anticipated, was still a crushing blow to the morale of his people. The fight for Jerusalem was no longer a cause led by a king whose very existence defied the laws of nature. It was a struggle that had lost its most powerful symbol. While Baldwin's legacy as a fierce leader continued to inspire the Crusaders, his passing marked a turning point in the history of the Holy Land. The subsequent years saw Saladin solidify his control, not just over Jerusalem, but over the entire region. His forces swept through the weakened Crusader states, reclaiming territory lost in the previous decades. However, as he expanded his empire, he could not erase the image of Baldwin IV's defiance at Montgisard from his mind. For Saladin, Baldwin's unwavering resolve had become a specter, haunting him with the realization that even the most carefully laid plans could be undone by the will of one man. He had defeated Baldwin's army at Montgisard, but that victory had come at a cost that Saladin could not ignore. The psychological toll of that battle was not just felt by the Crusaders, as it left a scar on Saladin himself. He had won the battle, but the memory of the Leper King who had fought without fear, without hesitation, would stay with him for the rest of his life. In the years after Baldwin's death, Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem was marked by a mixture of triumph and uneasy reflection. While his forces took the city and re-established Muslim rule, it was a victory tainted by the ghost of Baldwin IV. Saladin had, in the end, achieved what many thought impossible. He had reclaimed Jerusalem. But it was Baldwin's memory, his legend, that would linger long after the final Crusader was driven from the city. For the Crusaders who remained in the Holy Land, Baldwin's death signified the end of an era. The unifying force that had held the Crusader states together had been a king who could inspire both loyalty and awe. Without Baldwin, the Crusaders were left in disarray, and the kingdom he had fought so hard to build began to crumble under the weight of internal conflicts and the relentless pressure from Saladin's forces. The once unified front was now divided, with various factions vying for control. The lack of a clear leader only made the situation worse. As the Crusader states fell one by one, the memory of Baldwin's victory at Montgisard became a beacon of hope for those who still fought to defend Jerusalem. His legacy endured, not through territorial gains or military conquests, but in the hearts of those who believed in his unbreakable spirit. His actions at Montgisard would become a legend, passed down through generations, not as a tale of military might, but as a story of the power of human will. The victory was not won because the Crusaders had superior weapons or tactics. It was won because Baldwin IV had refused to accept that his fate, or the fate of his kingdom, was sealed. In the years following Baldwin's death, many Crusader knights would take up his cause, fighting in smaller battles and skirmishes, trying to recapture lost ground. Yet, as the years wore on, Saladin's forces continued to push the Crusaders back. It became increasingly clear that the dream of a Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land was fading. The Crusader states could not hold out forever, and one by one, they fell under Saladin's rule. But Baldwin IV's influence, his remarkable ability to lead even as his body was ravaged by disease, was not easily forgotten. By the time Jerusalem finally fell in 1187, Baldwin IV's name was etched into the history of the Holy Land. The battle at Montgisard had been an extraordinary moment, the brief spark of triumph that, despite its fleeting nature, had ignited a fire of hope within the Crusader ranks. His story became a symbol not of military success, but of resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. Baldwin had shown the world that even when all seemed lost, there was always a chance to fight for what was right, even if the outcome was uncertain. After Baldwin's death, Saladin continued his conquest of the Holy Land, reclaiming the cities one by one, but Jerusalem's fall was marked by a bittersweet sense of victory. He had regained the city, but Baldwin IV's spirit lingered in the streets, in the stories and the hearts of those who had fought beside him. Baldwin had inspired not just the Crusaders who had followed him, but even Saladin himself, who, in the quiet moments of reflection, could not ignore the memory of the leper king who had defied the very odds of nature and lead his people to an impossible victory. BaldwinIV's death was the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in ways that neither he nor Saladin could have anticipated. His story would be told for generations to come, not as a tale of a king who held power through force, but as the story of a man who held on to his will to fight, even as his body deteriorated beyond recognition. In the end, BaldwinIV's greatest victory was not the defense of Jerusalem or more the triumph at Montgisard, was the demonstration that the human spirit could overcome even the most unimaginable challenges. His fight against illness, against overwhelming odds, would echo through history as a reminder that true strength does not lie in the body, but in the heart and mind that refuse to give up.